We read this as background because this is Ascension Sunday, and this is in some ways the background to the Ascension story. That there aren't a lot of Ascension stories in the Bible, but there is more than one. So it's worth understanding what's going on in the background. Ascension is not unknown, it's just very rare. This story, just like the story that we're about to read about Jesus, is about succession and task. The idea is that the great leader is leaving. Now what? And there's a number of succession stories in the Old Testament, and this one is both a succession and an ascension story at the same time. And it's also at the same time about transfer of power, that Elijah is the great prophet of God, and he is about to be taken away. So now what? Now what happens? The Elijah Elisha stories are different than Jesus' story because Elisha has already been chosen by God to be Elijah's successor. There's one successor, and he's going to be the one. But even exactly how much of Elijah's power is unknown. This does not lead in the Old Testament to a general belief that we are all going to heaven after we die. This is a very rare thing. It's an unusual thing. Only a few get to do that. But it does mean that Elijah is available to return, which is why in the New Testament we read the story about John the Baptist being the next Elijah, because the assumption in Judaism is that, well, you have to die properly in order to die properly, I suppose. So this is the prequel to the story of Jesus' ascension that Deb will read in a little while. Good morning. It would be tempting to stand up here and say, well, it's not always this chaotic on Sunday morning, but most of you know better. Ascension Sunday. Ascension Sunday in the context of the Elijah story. Ascension Sunday in the context of, well, life as it goes on, right? One of the differences between the Elijah story and the Jesus story is that the Jesus story is much more focused on Jesus. Because, it doesn't actually say it in Acts, but earlier, Luke has told this same story in the book of Luke. And there it says they worshiped him. I don't think anyone ever worshiped Elijah. But still here, there's a context of the ongoing mission of this group. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says that Peter is the one, right? You are Peter, you are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. But that's Matthew's perspective, and Matthew always thinks things like that, and Luke doesn't. Luke is very much focused on Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the place. But there is no one individual that continues the mission. Rather, the mission is spread out. It goes to the community in Jerusalem, and it goes then, of course, beyond that to the whole world. And of course, part of this is the continuation of power. Where does power now reside? Or who is given the power? Who now has the Holy Spirit? And this is in a lot of ways the biggest change, because now you have the Holy Spirit. And I realize that most of you may not have done any miracles recently or ever, but still, you have the Holy Spirit. That power that existed in Elijah and then in Elisha and in the other prophets and in Jesus and in the early church is still here. Hard to believe, isn't it? But still true, right? It's still available. And it's always about the larger program. And this is so much bigger a task than even the one that Elijah handed on to Elisha, because that was just about Israel. That was about this tiny little group to make sure they were following God. And Elijah and Elisha, they didn't really care about anybody outside of the borders and which God they were following. But suddenly Jesus comes and he says, oh, by the way, this whole mission that we've got is to Israel and. right? And to the whole world, and to you and me, right? And so it becomes a really, really big thing. So the mission continues. And it continues in the church, but the mission is not the church, right? Jesus didn't come to start an institution. There's a program here, and the institution of the church is meant to continue the program, but the institution isn't the purpose. Jesus didn't come to start a committee. Now, I realize it took the early church about 6 weeks after Jesus' death to form the first committee, right? So, you know, committees happen, might be the way to put this, but committees aren't the point, right? The committees are always about the mission, right? We don't, of course, in our church don't have committees. We're above that. We have teams. But, right, teams are always about task, not about existing. So that is, right, that is always part of the recognition that this is still the mission. The Holy Spirit is there to empower the mission, and the mission continues. Now, I also realize here that what I've been doing is very much reflecting my own German heritage. That my German heritage tells me what we need to do is we need to study these passages carefully and analyze them and think about them and then get back to work. All right? And in all of this, try not to let our emotions get in the way of good thinking. But if you've been to a spirit-filled church, you'll know that emotions are in a lot of ways a lot of the point, right? And that Jesus, whatever we know about him, wasn't a good German, right? And the early church was not run by good Germans, right? But here I am anyway. So we need to remember, now, again, also remembering that the Ascension story, the emotions are tricky. How do you feel about this story? Jesus dies. That one's easy, right? But then Jesus comes back, sort of. And then he goes away again, and then he comes back, and then he goes away again. And then he appears again. And then he goes up into heaven. And so you can just imagine the disciples looking up into heaven. But what are they feeling? And I don't think there's any way we can know that, right? Because we're not first century Jewish/Palestinian folks. We're us, right? But they must have felt something. And, right, certainly on Pentecost, which we're coming up to, they're going to feel a lot more, right? Hopefully less confusion, definitely less confusion, and more excitement. Also recognizing that in the end, we are us, right? And if I, am expecting all of you to jump up and start waving and dancing and shouting, that's probably not going to happen, right? We have to be us. But it's okay, right, to get a bit excited about this. It's okay to feel about this sort of thing. It's probably a really good idea to pretend that we don't. So the Ascension, it's tricky, it's interesting. Now go back to work. So now it's time for some breakout rooms, which again is tricky and interesting. And I don't know how you feel about them. But anyway, Philip, if you want to put us out into breakout rooms, and those of us, the rest of us can share emotions if you want to.